Yes.
Do you find that the pharmaceutical companies will withdraw a working drug at the end of the patent life cycle to put in a new drug to replace that?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. That's one of the reasons that our drugs are less safe. Basically what he asked was, will the drug companies put in a new drug to replace one that's off patent? And the answer is yes, in a way. I mean, they also have their own generic of their own drug, but what they will do is they will develop, because now they have another dilemma. The generic companies are going to compete. The only way they can get rid of that competition is to patent a different type of drug, maybe slightly different, develop it all over again. Now the thing is, they don't know anything about the side effects of this new drug. So instead of using an older drug where we know the side effects and we know what to be careful with, we start with a new drug where the safety effects are not known, where there's a higher risk that will do something that we don't realize until it's too late. So this is one reason why drugs are less safe today, is because even if all the drug did was work for another indication, another disease for which it wasn't originally approved for, it's usually cheaper to develop or it makes more economic sense, I should say. It's not cheaper. It makes more economic sense to start a whole new drug program with a whole new drug rather than use the old one and get an approval for the other disease. Why? Because the patent will run out by the time they get approval for that other disease. So they've got to start all over again so they can have the monopoly protection, so they might be able to recover their development costs. Now I know this sounds kind of convoluted, and it is. There's a reason it sounds convoluted. It is. It's crazy. It's crazy. And once you start understanding how these regulations work against you and drive up healthcare costs, not just in pharmaceuticals, but every other one, then you realize what the problem with healthcare is. And then when people come to you and say, well, we need universal healthcare, you know what to tell them. Universal healthcare means healthcare rationing. There's only one way that we can all get the healthcare we need, and that is to make sure that we have the freedom to get innovation, inexpensive supplements when that's the right answer, breakthrough drugs when it's not, and the only way we're going to do this and keep costs down is get rid of the waste, and all the waste, well, maybe not all of it, but almost all the waste is in the regulatory system. Okay, the question was, if you didn't have patents, if you got rid of these amendments, and wouldn't insurance companies insist that you use the generic as soon as possible? Well, the answer to that is there really wouldn't be a difference between generic and patented for the most part, because if you're not patenting the drug, you're just getting it to market, then in essence, it is a generic drug. But what keeps the drug company profiting in that situation is the fact that they were first to market and have brand name. Now that used to be really, really important, and the reason is that not all companies had the same quality. So what would happen is companies would actually advertise that our anti-serum or whatever, our serum has never had this type of a reaction, some common side effect or something, or our medicine doesn't have this problem. We have a record of safety, and this is how they were advertised. And people who use brand names, actually did that because they felt it was worth paying a few cents more and getting that safety factor. That was part of how the market protected people. And also, of course, there were other third-party evaluations. One thing I wanted to share with you that you might not be aware of is that the FDA doesn't do any drug testing. No, not one. The drug company does the drug testing, they write up the results, and then they send literally a truckload or two of paper to the FDA. The FDA reads the paper, and if they think everything looks on the up and up, then they approve the drug. But the company does its own testing. There isn't any third-party testing. So the FDA isn't testing drugs. That's an important thing for you to be aware of. And that's why there's been some drug scandals, because you can imagine with all this monetary pressure that sometimes things aren't put quite the way they could be. Now, I have to tell you, it is actually hard to do that because of the process. Information goes through so many hands before it gets to the FDA. You would think at some point it would get caught, and it would most usually do that. But if you really had a concerted effort to mask something, it's possible to do it. Whereas if you had third-party testing, you wouldn't have that problem either. Any other questions? Okay, so put your hand up first.
What was the time delay between the first market and the second market?
Well, that depended. Usually, there'd be 2 or 3 companies working on the same type of drug at the same time. And when one turned out to be, you know, you kind of knew your competitor was ahead of you to some extent. And so when that happens, you might reposition your drug if you're going to be second to market, by which I mean if the other company was putting out a certain dose or a certain method of delivery, you know, like oral versus nasal or something, you might change that in the process. And sometimes there were a matter of months in between the two, and sometimes there would be many months. It just depended on how far the program was along. Now, the FDA, of course, can manipulate this. How do they do this? Well, if they know, of course, every drug company that's doing anything, because you have to let them know, otherwise you can't do the human studies. So some of the FDA examiners were taken to task because they played the game of keeping one drug company from getting to the market for the other one by simply demanding more studies. You see, when you submit stuff to the FDA, at any point in time they can say, you know, I think you need more studies of this, this, and this, and this. And you don't dare object because you have, you know, 10, 15 drugs in the pipeline, and if you get them upset about one drug, you're kind of nervous that maybe, you know, they'll punish you by delaying your other ones. So now the FDA can actually manipulate who gets first to market. Yeah, so it's a whole nother factor. Yes, in the back.
I hear stories of my predecessor, Mark Fritz, who's now routinely doing a speech. He would grab an electric cord and go like this. And his point was, why do I think that's safe? The point he was making was that this is tested by a private firm called Underwriters Laboratory. Is there or was there an institution like that in the drug industry that assured people without government intervention of the safety of their drugs?
The question was, is there something like Underwriters, or was there something like Underwriters Laboratory before the FDA came along to ensure that there was third-party testing and some types of safety testing? And the answer is yes. Even though the drug industry was pretty young, the AMA actually did tests and reported on them in their journal. Also, Consumers Research did so. There was something called Pharmaceutical Letters, which is still around today, which talked about the different drugs and their impact on patients. So there were a lot of different ways in which people knew about safety effects of drugs. And very interestingly enough, usually the increase in regulation followed some type of drug disaster. And the one that really began the safety testing at the FDA was an instance where an antibiotic was dissolved in an unsafe liquid. And that was because prior to that time, you know, you didn't have a solution, it wasn't well absorbed. And they were trying to get something as well absorbed, but they didn't do any testing, and it turned out not to be safe for children. And I bring this to your attention because the physicians who were paying attention to the AMA evaluation weren't using it because it had not been evaluated by them yet. So the market was protecting the physicians who paid attention to the testing that their own society did. And incidentally, even though that looks like it was negligence on the part of the drug manufacturer, the chemist who put that together killed himself over that incident because he was so distressed by it. So clearly it was a mistake, not some type of nefarious profit-making motive, because there really is no profit in killing your customer. In fact, it's very detrimental to the health